Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening or morning or afternoon or night, depending on where you're connecting from. This is Gabriel Fernandez Borsot. I'm Alef Trust's Applied Program Leader. I manage the overall coordination of Alef Trust certificate programs, and I'm core faculty of our MSc program in Consciousness, Spirituality, and Transpersonal Psychology. We're here today for an open house session with Dr. Emma Bragdon. At the Alef Trust, we're very glad that Emma has chosen us to offer his 3-hour workshops and 6-week courses in partnership with us. She's a world authority on recognizing and supporting people in a spiritual awakening and spiritual crisis. She's a pioneer in this field with more than 44 years of experience accompanying spiritual seekers and consciousness explorers in their challenging transformative experiences, and has trained more than 100 spiritual emergent coaches. She authored 2 classic books on the subject with 5 others on similar themes, and she is the executive director of Integrative Mental Health University. Next, Emma will present his work and the 6-week course on how to effectively support people in spiritual awakening and spiritual crisis that she's offering at the Alef Trust. And after her presentation, there will be time for questions from the attendees. You can post your questions in the chat box during the session, and I will moderate the Q&A period. So now and during the session, also feel free to open your webcams if you want to. This way, your experience will be more similar to how the course webinars are. But we are aware that the session is being recorded and you may appear in the recording. Okay, so thank you very much, Emma, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Gabriel. So it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Nice to get a glimpse on gallery view of some of your lovely faces. I am in Mexico at the time, and you can see I'm in the middle of the day, lovely sunlight. But I wanted to just warn you that in the last 4 or 5 days, I've had some trouble with internet. So if by any chance I get frozen out, Gabriel has assured me that he will stay on, and then I'll be coming back within a minute. So please don't give up because if I suddenly disappear or get frozen or something like that. So I wanted to thank Alef Trust for being the host for this particular open house. It's really a pleasure to be working with them, and I'm delighted to be with all of you. If you would please feel free to use the chat box, and if you have any kind of questions that come up during my presentation, which I'll be doing with a PowerPoint and if you have any questions, please feel free to immediately put them in the chat box. And I may not immediately answer them, but we will get back to them because there'll be time for Q&A after the presentation. The other thing is I believe very strongly in community building, and those people who are really interested in spiritual crisis, spiritual emergence and emergency, we are not in the majority. So community building amongst people who are interested in this, I think, is a very important part of all the presentations that I give. And so if you want to use the chat box to introduce yourself, to give your email or your website, please feel free to do that. But again, that would only be if you want to be contacted, right? And that's contacted by other people who are in this presentation as viewers. So again, I welcome you all, and I'm going to share my screen so that I can give the presentation that I prepared. Gabriel, are you there?
Yes, you have the icon. It's just the upper left corner, play from start.
Okay.
Yep.
a different orientation, but thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm still on gallery view, Gabriel. So if you could shift it to speaker view so that I can see more of my screen, that would be great.
Yeah, that's something you have to do in your local computer. I mean, now the attendees are just seeing you as a spotlighted and the presentation, so it's correct for them.
Okay.
It's just on your
Um,
computer. Is that okay for you? If not, you can change it. Should be something in the upper side of your in the controls.
yeah, it's not available to me anymore, so I'll just go ahead.
Okay.
And actually, I enjoy looking at other people too. So my name is Emma Bragdon. You see it there. And I'm going to be doing some slides and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. So the agenda for today is I want to say a little bit more about myself. And then I think it's really important to give some definitions about what is this territory of spiritual awakening, sometimes called spiritual emergence. What is spiritual crisis, sometimes called spiritual emergency. I'll be going very briefly over some of the a category. There are 13 categories, but I'll just be mentioning one. And with the catalysts for spiritual crisis, there are, of course, many, but I'll just be mentioning a little bit. Then we'll look at how conventional psychology and psychiatry looks at spiritual emergence and spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency. We'll look at some of the reasons that education is needed in this particular field, and we'll look at some notions about caring for someone in spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis, and some opportunities for further learning, and then Q&A. So in terms of who I am, my PhD was earned back in the 80s, and that was in transpersonal psychology, or the psychology of going beyond ego. My specialty, both in graduate school and beyond, and that's been for the last 30, 40 years, has been around spiritual crisis and how that fits into mental health, the way we conceive of mental health. So I am the founder as well as the executive director of the organization called Integrative Mental Health University. Most of our courses are online, some are on location. I've been teaching primarily for since 1990, and I've done extensive research in Brazil because the Brazilian Spiritists, which is a subculture, which is related to spiritualism, but they have a wonderful way of helping people who are in spiritual crisis to resolve the distress and to move on into integrating their experience. So I've learned a lot from them and teach more about what I've learned. So I have authored 7 books. I've been the co-producer of 2 documentary films in this area that we're focusing on today. And I have been an experiencer, life experiencer for all the categories of awakening, except for one, which is I haven't had a difficult time with addictions outside of what is considered normal, right? Like a little bit of addiction to ice cream in the summertime. And I am a mother, a grandmother, and I think I've earned the right to say I'm an elder at this point. So on from there, a little bit about the books. The ones that would be most relevant for you today are on the upper left-hand corner of your screen, which is a source book for helping people with spiritual problems. It's not called Helping People in Spiritual Emergency or in Spiritual Crisis because the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which most mental health practitioners access, speak about these issues around spiritual crisis as spiritual problems. So that's why we have the title of that book, with spiritual problems. And then that source book for helping people with spiritual problems is more academic and more structured towards healthcare providers or coaches. And The Call of Spiritual Emergency, another book, is more narrative. So there are many more stories about how people have experienced a spiritual crisis and how they've resolved it and what that resolution looks like. So both of those books are available at Amazon if you're interested. And then two other books on the left side, Resources for Extraordinary Healing. Again, lots of stories about resources outside of the conventional model, but I never take an anti-psychiatry point of view, but we're really looking at a fuller expanse of what's available for assisting people with mental health issues, and in this book with physical issues as well. And then the newest DSM is kind of a satire on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So I think it's good for us all to maintain our sense of humor with all of these things as mental health in psychology and psychiatry continue to evolve. So if you're interested in some of the research I've done in Brazil, Kardec's Spiritism is a good introduction to the Spiritist point of view and their therapies. And then Spiritism and Mental Health is, again, a bit more academic, lots and lots of references, resources for further exploration, and chapters not only by myself, but by several other psychiatrists and psychologists, not only from Brazil, but also from the UK and the United States. And then Spiritism in the bottom right-hand corner is one of the documentary films. It's half an hour long, and it documents more about Spiritism in Brazil. So if you're interested in learning more, you could go to imhu.org/store to learn more and also access where you can purchase these. So getting into the definitions, I think it's important to recognize that what we call spiritual experiences may be very different from depending on a person's point of view or their religious or cultural orientation. But I'd like to just suggest that we look at it as experiences of a higher perspective. So in other words, it's beyond the five senses that we usually use to orient ourselves in the world. And it opens and expands what's oftentimes called the sixth sense or intuition. And oftentimes people will say, well, that comes from the third eye, which of course we don't see as an eyeball, but has been marked in the, especially in India, literally with a red dot here to signify the place which we associate with the sixth sense. So experiences from this point of view go beyond our social conditioning. So in other words, what we've learned from our parents, what we've learned from religion, our schools, which has basically helped us construct an ego and a way of getting along in the world. So some examples of spiritual experiences might be visions of a greater reality, including one's own future or possibly the future of another person. I interviewed a woman this week who was told by her grandfather at age 6 that she had the gift of being able to speak in a very universal way and tell universal stories. Well, she's actually got now 2 films on Netflix that are extremely popular that really do go over some universal archetypal stories for human beings. So she also has had visions of a greater reality and has been able to really put it to use to help other people through the films that she's done. Then another example, communication with spirit guides or a higher power. And that might be someone who also is channeling, or a psychic who is able to contact spirit guides from the other side and help other people through a more expanded view of what their life is about. Specific sensing of others' realities might come to some people who become or are functioning as energy workers, or again, empaths, and also could be profound inspiration, manifesting through poetry, music, technology, painting, all kinds of creative arts. So these may all be termed spiritual experiences. They can occur at any time, including through practices aimed at altering consciousness. For instance, meditation, hatha yoga, the use of psychedelics and plant medicines, and more. By the way, those who are just coming in, and I notice there are more people coming in now, please feel free to use the chat box to post your questions. I'll try to attend to them later, but also feel free to use it to put in your website or your email and your name, location, if you would like to basically participate in more of a community and be able to dialogue with people who are in this presentation. So we're looking now at spiritual awakening, also called spiritual emergence, and that's a process which can involve many, many spiritual experiences, but which ultimately leads to something we call enlightenment or self-realization. There are many, many other names for it, and I'm just offering a few so that we can orient. Now, a Gallup poll in 2023 said 41% of adults in the United States have experienced a spiritual awakening, meaning they've had some kind of profound spiritual experiences. However, few people are really talking about it and discussing it in public because it is still sidelined, and many people don't acknowledge or understand what this is all about. And people who speak about their spiritual experiences may be, in fact, considered on the lunatic fringe. So oftentimes people won't speak openly about their experiences, but it can involve identifying with the wisdom self or soul rather than the ego. So something that we would consider deeper than the ego or more expanded than the ego. It involves a profound psycho-spiritual transformation. So as one continues on the path of awakening, there can be more and more transformation that goes along with it. In other words, it could be, we could put it in language as a person disidentifies with the ego and identifies more with the wisdom self or soul. That transformation typically brings on new values, new beliefs, new priorities. So it also typically brings people into feelings of much deeper peace and much deeper desire to be in service to what is most vital and alive in Earth community, let's say. So many people will become activists in promoting a more healthy, compassionate way of living. Spiritual crisis, also called spiritual emergency, involves a disorientation or a distress that can become debilitating as one is going through this awakening process. So sometimes a person will think, well, wait a minute, I had this dream last night that is really impacting me on a very profound level. Or I had this sense of what my future will bring, or I had this knowledge of maybe a past life experience I've had or someone else has had. What was that all about? Where does it come from? Is it real? Am I crazy? So if a person goes very deeply into those kinds of questions and the distress that comes from it, it can be very disorienting because people are basically choosing what's real, what's not real. And a big existential question, who am I really to be having these kinds of experiences? So if at the time someone is having these questions and having this distress, they also begin to have contact with previous trauma, which can happen, then the situation can become quite overwhelming. So for instance, someone is having big spiritual experiences, and at the same time, all of a sudden, repressed sexual abuse comes forward, and they start having to deal with both ends of the spectrum. In other words, profound trauma and how to integrate that into their life story. But on the other hand, maybe a very profound opening spiritually. But as people resolve both of these, then the outcome is actually something we can term human flourishing. In other words, there's greater peace, greater self-acceptance, deeper connections with all people, but also in some cases, all of nature, including animals and all beings. So I mentioned earlier that there are many categories that we could say are ways of experiencing these phenomena that are associated with spiritual awakening or spiritual emergence. So Stan Grof, who originally created the word spiritual emergence and emergency, lists about 12 or 13 categories, and I'm going to go into just one of them. So there are many categories, and that does not mean that a person has to experience all of the categories in order to actually spiritually awaken, but it simply means there are at least 13 categories, and a person may experience one or two over a lifetime, or they may experience 3 or 4 simultaneously, which of course will involve more integration. So there's no way of saying what's going to come forward first or last or in the middle, but there are at least 13 categories. I'm thinking we should add the fires that are going on in the Los Angeles area as another category, but that's just current events. So sticking to this particular presentation and the universality of it, psychic opening is an opening in perceptual fields. So again, this relates to the third eye, an opening to subtle perception. The third eye usually associated with an area here, literally between the two eyes, right between the eyebrows, but it also connects to the pineal gland, which is inside of your head and inside of your brain. But as there is an opening of the third eye, some people will literally begin feeling connection to spirit guides and begin articulating what they get from the spirit guides, putting it into words, and sometimes writing the words that they find. Sometimes people move into clairvoyance, being able to see things that other people aren't seeing. For instance, being able to connect with someone else that is maybe not even in the direct area where you are, but being able to have a sense of connection and actually seeing that person and what they're doing or how they're feeling. Clairaudience has to do with clear hearing, where one might be able to hear things that other people aren't hearing, but being able to hear, in some cases, some wisdom that may be coming from sources of higher intelligence. Clairsentience has to do with clear feeling. So one might be an empath and be able to sense very clearly what another person is feeling without them indicating in any kind of physical way or verbally how they're feeling. So the same could be said for tasting or smelling. And as an example, I have a person who's highly sensitive in this area, and she can go into an environment and sense through, it's hard to say exactly how, but she'll come from out the environment that maybe has a very negative vibration or something very negative has happened there, and she'll say, "Oh, I have a bad taste in my mouth." Or it's as if that area still smells terrible, but nothing that other people might pick up. It's only a way of sensing the more subtle vibrations that are going on in that particular environment. So you can imagine someone who has no orientation to this, recognizing that it can be extremely frightening at first. So if someone has no orientation to the fact that there may be spirit guides, in other words, beings of higher intelligence that might have a very, very benevolent motivation, if they suddenly come to the person and start speaking to them, as it were, the spirit guide may be invisible to them, but suddenly this person is hearing voices. And the notion that we have from psychology and psychiatry is if you're hearing any kind of voice that other people are not hearing, or sensing the presence of like a spirit that other people can't see, that you're likely crazy. So it can't, if a person has no orientation, no conceptual framework around this, and they start experiencing spirit guides in this example, it can be extremely frightening, especially when those perceptual abilities have been repressed or one's culture does not accept them. So I was fortunate enough in Brazil to meet a man by the name of Marco, who told me that, gave me permission to talk about his story. And he was brought up in a very rigid and also very dedicated Catholic family. And when he started hearing voices, and there were 3 or 4 that were happening simultaneously, he felt, well, I must be absolutely crazy. And his family took him to the best psychiatrist in Sao Paulo. And the psychiatrist said, yes, you do need to take antipsychotics. This is an indication that you are having a psychotic break. So he didn't do well with that, but just to leave you with a good sense of the story, he later went on to get some help from spiritists, and it turned out that he was basically a channeler and energy worker in the rough. So once he'd had training and once he'd been able to be with other people who had the same kind of gifts that he had, he actually became quite grounded and was able to then also be a tremendous asset in his community as someone who could channel higher information and also be able to do healing work with people. So in his case, we could say he entered into Christ consciousness and a kind of mystical experience as he began to explore further what his true gifts were. And that happens to many people who start opening up the third eye. And that doesn't mean that you have to be Christian to have Christ consciousness, but Christ consciousness is generally used as one phrase. There are many phrases, but it's a phrase that indicates one is opening up to the feeling of union with love itself. In other words, a communion with love itself. And another way of looking at that entry to Christ consciousness is an intuitive felt sense of being one with all living beings. And of course, having an experience like that, whether it's for a few seconds or longer, it leads to increased wisdom, a compassion, and a desire to be in service, which is exactly what happened to Marco. He wanted to be in service and wanted to have his gifts help him be in service to fellow beings. So let's take a moment now and consider that I just invite you to consider for yourself, have you recently had any unusual or profound experiences that felt spiritual or otherworldly in nature? And feel free, if you'd like to put something in the chat box that is in reference to that question. And or the question, have you been experiencing intense emotions or thoughts that seem to be related to spiritual or existential questions? Another question, are you finding it difficult to reconcile your spiritual experiences with your current beliefs, values, or life circumstances? So feel free to post something in the chat box to share with others, or you might just take a piece of paper and make notes for yourself. And I'll just give you a couple minutes to use the chat box or to create some kind of self-reflection on a piece of paper that's yours alone. And meanwhile, I'm going to also ask Gabriel if you would be kind enough to post the screening in
Yes.
the chat box. And
Yes.
this is basically my gift to all of you today, which is a very general screening tool that you can use for yourself to recognize if you're going through some kind of a spiritual awakening process. But it's also something that you could use if you're coaching someone else, or if you're concerned about a family member, a loved one who may be going through this spiritual awakening process. And it can be very useful also for people who are licensed as medical doctors, nurses, psychotherapists of different kinds, and coaches. So in the other courses that I give through Alef Trust, a 3-hour course as well as a 6-week course, we go more deeply into the screening so that people can not only reflect themselves on whether they've had these kinds of experiences, but that they can see more clearly how to bring that into their coaching or counseling that they're doing with other people, so that it increases one's sensitivity and ability to really recognize, is a spiritual awakening process going on? Because of course, that can mean a lot if you're in a role where you need to do diagnosis, or be expected to actually give some prognosis to a person, what's going to be happening next. And if you're in a position to be saying, oh, you're maybe in a psychotic process and need antipsychotics. So it can be extremely important to understand if someone is going through a spiritual awakening process.
And
So,
I just have posted in the chat
okay,
the link to the Word document with the screening questionnaire that you're mentioning. They can just click on that and download it, just for them to
okay,
know.
great. And if anyone has any problem with the instruction that Gabriel just gave, please put it in the chat box so we can address it. So you have the screening tool if you want it. Okay, going on from here, let's take a closer look at what conventional psychiatry and psychology offers. So there's very little mention of spirituality in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is used all across the world. And so I'm most familiar with that as an American, because that's really the book that we use as licensed psychotherapists when we're looking at diagnostics. So the DSM-5, which is our most recent one, that came out in 2013, says basically spiritual experiences are part of culture. In other words, they can be part of religion and spirituality, family structures, life cycle stages, ceremonial rituals and customs, as well as moral and legal systems. And the notion of where this belongs in the DSM, in this big book, is that goes in the very back of the book, almost like an appendix, and basically states that these experiences are not of themselves or a spiritual problem that someone might have, which is cultural, is not part of pathology itself. However, the DSM does not even go into what I've gone into in the first moments of this particular presentation. In other words, they don't talk about the kinds of spiritual experiences someone might have. Instead, they're basically making a very general statement that some weird experiences might be happen, but they're culturally oriented. And just recognize that some people have some strange experiences. What is mentioned in the DSM is that it's a good idea to do a cultural formation interview, but that might uncover some kind of problem that a person is having with religion or spirituality. For instance, leaving one religion because they're uncomfortable with it and wanting to find something else. However, there's again, nothing that really goes into depth about what a spiritual experience is and how to assist someone who is going through an intense spiritual experience or awakening processes. So unfortunately, because there is this vacancy in the DSM and it's not addressed very specifically, there's a lot of misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatments for lack of training and guidance. So if you think again about Marco, the Brazilian man I told you about, he was beginning to hear voices, and one of the best psychiatrists in Sao Paulo couldn't recognize that he was a channeler in the rough or an energy worker in the rough, and instead said he was likely having a psychotic break, and was, because the symptoms, as he called them, progressed and continued on, that he was likely schizophrenic. So what we have here, just to bring in one of the books that is used by the psychiatrists and psychologists in the UK, the ICD-11. So it classifies also mental disease as well as the DSM, as mentioned. So they do have this code of spiritual or religious problem. So again, just to repeat, there's no definitive resource on the experiences and phenomena which the various religions, spiritual traditions, and cultural contexts consider as normal, expected, desirable, or pathological. So this whole area of spiritual experiences is really, has really not been articulated or brought into our understanding of mental health or mental illness. But without such a resource, how could healthcare workers be expected to adequately respond to the challenging variants of these phenomena and correctly differentiate them from pathology? So that's a big question. And I'm coming from a place of that providers need to become competent in diagnosis and treatment of spiritual issues, or people are going to be misdiagnosed, given medication that they don't need, and possibly even damaged or traumatized by meeting up with healthcare workers who can't fully understand what's going on with them. So AI helped me to create these particular illustrations to show that the older psychiatrists who were trained decades ago, but also the newer healthcare providers of various cultures who were trained more recently, none of them are getting this information within their medical school or nursing training or psychological training around spiritual emergence and emergency. So we could say they were missing the boat. And so if we aren't in a position to recognize this, we aren't then in a position to support human flourishing. Just a second. So if healthcare providers are not mandated to become more sensitive, using either the cultural formulation or the cultural formulation interview, and they aren't getting personal experience and they aren't getting training, then there is in that group, especially of people who are in the role of psychiatrists, psychologists, nursing, medical doctors, and even counselors of various kinds, they tend to discount spiritual experiences and the whole process of awakening because they don't understand it. So then where can a person go to get help and support? That's a very important question. And if we look at caring for someone in spiritual emergency, we need to recognize that there is this missing piece in the training of healthcare providers. So we can't expect most providers to recognize or understand this area of spiritual awakening. And that includes then most of the public has had no introduction at all, so that most people don't understand when it's happening within themselves or a loved one, and don't know where to go to get the kind of support they might need in order to integrate their experiences. So again, that can lead to misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatment both by people who are highly trained as medical professionals, let's say, but also by family members who say, oh, if you're hearing voices, that must mean that you're in a psychotic process. So again, this can lead to a tremendous amount of trauma with people feeling like they must be crazy. One of the things that I've done in the organization that I lead, Integrative Mental Health University, is I've trained spiritual emergence coaches to be able to recognize and work with people who are in this process of awakening and maybe in a spiritual crisis as a result of it. So you see the the website address here to contact coaches, and that can be an important resource to have for yourself or to direct others to. And so I'll go on further with some opportunities that are available through Alef Trust now, if you're interested in getting further training. So we will be doing one other open house. I'll be guiding it again, February 9th. If you know other people who might like to be introduced to this. There's also a 3-hour online workshop. The next one will be January 26th from 4 to 7 in UK time. And then there's a 6-week course that Alef is sponsoring that I'll be teaching. And that will be March 9th through April 19th. 7 to 8:30 p.m. in the UK. So in terms of the 3-hour online workshop, that will go into more on screening and how to use that and for yourself, but also with clients, and involve more group discussion, because I really prefer to work in a way where there's a lot of interaction. And then in the second hour, what a spiritual crisis feels like, so we can sensitize ourselves to what a person is feeling like and going through, and thus be in a better position to assist them. So we'll look at some of the evidence basis that is out there for what works in terms of how to support others who are going through this awakening, and what resources can we call on that may be helpful in that situation. And the third hour, how society currently perceives and treats spiritual crisis, but more importantly, the cultures that model excellent care. And I think that one of the most important tools that we offer is a chart to help with discerning the difference between spiritual crisis and pathology, meaning any kind of mental imbalance. I know that Alef Trust is going to offer a financial credit if someone takes the 3-hour online workshop and then goes on to take the 6-week course.
Yes, they can fully apply it as a discount. The 3-hour workshop costs £80, and then they get an £80 discount in the 6 weeks course if they register for the 6 weeks course.
Thank you for illuminating that. So in the 6 weeks course, we go into really just into more depth into describing the positive transformative outcomes of a spiritual crisis when someone gets the right support. So going into models of care so that people can really understand how to manage this appropriately is extremely important, because it's not the same model of care that one learns in graduate school or in most trainings. So we're looking at improving the way we can offer support, understanding all 13 categories, in other words, ways people may be having spiritual experiences that lead to awakening, and recognizing the catalysts that are going on for this awakening process right now in our world. And so becoming more competent both cognitively, in other words, having a conceptual framework for this whole area, but also with some practical skills. So I wanted to mention that taking this 6 weeks course online is a prerequisite to the 2-day workshop that's offered by imhu.org, so that one is certified to become a spiritual emergence coach and be listed in our directory. So the materials, again, will involve more on screening and more on an expanse of tools that are used for screening that you may not be aware of. A very practical chart that we suggest people use, especially if they're in a counseling situation, so they can orient very quickly around diagnosing in an accurate way. There's a practical summary of care, again, so that one is more empowered to go into what care is needed, especially if you're working with someone who's in a more acute phase of their spiritual awakening process. There are guided self-reflections because, of course, our own what we bring to the situation of caring for someone else is extremely important, and we need to reflect on that. How other cultures successfully support the awakening process, I think, has been extremely important for giving perspective on ways that we can be supportive, and opportunities to network and discuss with other students can be extremely helpful in terms of acquiring other resources and deeper understanding of this whole area. And so video interviews with those who've experienced spiritual crisis can be extremely helpful, again, for expanding on perspective, and then additional resources for reading and viewing, and quizzes to reinforce learning. So again, the dates for the 6 weeks course, March 9th to April 19th. And I'll be doing the webinars as well as offering time for Q&A. It's all online, 90 minutes each for 6 Sunday evenings. And there will be adjacent supportive online materials that you can read through the week when we aren't meeting. Everyone is welcome for this. And that means people with lived experience who want to understand more what they've been through, and also those who care for them, which might be family, friends, counselors, psychiatrists, medical doctors, etc. If a healthcare provider wants to come to this, they will be able to incorporate the tools and practices offered in the program in ways that are beneficial to their clients or patients. But again, we're not looking at just an audience that are licensed professionals. We welcome people with lived experience and peer counselors. And then on completion of the 6 weeks course with Alef Trust, you'll get a professional certificate. My contact information, you're welcome to write me at eb@imhu.org. And of course, our website, it looks like I forgot to put in the slashes, but it's imhu.org. And then if you want to explore becoming certified as a spiritual emergence coach, you can either just go to our website, which is imhu.org, or there's a particular URL that I wrote out here to go directly to the information about the practicum, which is a 2-day live course, which I will be giving in London in April. And if you want more information about the courses at Alef Trust, of course, here's the URL for Alef Trust. And finally, if you're interested in some of what I've referenced today, feel free to take a picture maybe of this particular reference list. And then with Gabriel's help, we'll come back and we can do a bit of Q&A and the chatting. So I'll end the presentation here, stop sharing, and come back to you.
Yes. Emma, we've had some messages in the chat while you were talking, and the first one was asking about these 2 movies that you mentioned from these women who were told by her grandfather.
Oh, grandfather? Yes, sure.
Do you
So,
know these
yes,
movies? Okay.
yeah, I do. The woman's name is Nuran Evren Sit. She's Turkish, and what's available on YouTube, oh, excuse me, not YouTube, but Netflix, is first off, Another Self, 2 words, Another Self.
Uh-huh.
And then the other series available on Netflix is titled The Gift. Now, be
Okay.
sure that when you're looking for those, that you look for ones that were co-produced by Neuron Evren Sit, because those titles have been used by other people as well. And so hopefully you won't be confused. Is there another question, Gabriel?
Yeah, I'm just checking exactly the name of this person. Can you type in the chat, Noran,
Sure. I'll
just
do it.
for the spelling?
Neuron Evren Sit. And I just interviewed her this past week, and we'll be putting up a blog with
Yeah,
information also and links to her
yeah.
Netflix presentations.
Mhm.
But that will be coming up I'll put the way to access it in the chat box. imhu.org. So it's not there yet. It'll be coming up probably on Thursday this coming week, an interview with Neuron Evren Sit. Any other
Okay.
questions?
I'm reviewing the messages in the chat, and I just see a message by Travis Gray, but I'm not sure if it's a question. I think it's more when you have asked to reflect and share on reflections. So if he wants to ask something, I invite him to just raise his hand and open the microphone. In the meantime, we might hand over to Barbara, who has raised her hand. Barbara, please.
Oh, one sec.
Okay. Need to put on.
Hi, sorry, forgot my speakers are not working too well. So, yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting, Emma. I was wondering, do you think this training would also be useful to support people post a psychedelic experience?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I was
There are
hoping so.
many, pardon me?
I was hoping so because I'm thinking, I'm really interested in doing supporting people in preparation for ceremony, and then
Yes.
also post ceremony making sense of everything. So yeah, and I'm looking at opportunities to train more in depth in that. So I wondered if this would help.
Yes. So you may be familiar with a program called Psychedelics Today. It comes out of the United States. It's quite well regarded. And Kyle Buller, who's one of the founders, is a spiritual emergence coach, took the training from me, and they do just a little bit around spiritual emergency, that people who are in that role of being guides can recognize if someone is going through that process and would be less inclined to think of it as a psychotic break or as a mental illness, but would be in a position to be much more sensitive to how to support that particular person if they feel really disoriented and distressed because of the intensity of the experience they're having.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I thought it might. I thought I'd check. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the question. It looks like Travis has his hand up. I don't
Yes,
see any.
exactly. Travis,
Hello,
please.
Emma. Very
Hi,
nice to
Travis.
meet you, Dr. Bragdon. I have a few of your books, and
Oh,
I've worked with the Spiritual Emergence Network in the USA for several years. So I've known your work for a long time and haven't had this opportunity to interact, and that's it's very cool. It's exciting. I did put two questions in the chat. One of them, your three questions that you asked us to reflect on. I had a dream just this past evening or this morning that was pretty intense. So my one of my questions is, do you differentiate between the dream world and those included in the category of spiritual experiences?
let's see. I think that oftentimes people tune into amazing things that might be out of their awareness in their waking life. They tune into it in their dream life, and it might be actually moving into more connections with higher sources of intelligence, or giving them more perspective about their daily life, or about the someone that they're in relationship with, or even events going on in the world. So I would definitely say that people can have extremely powerful experiences in their dream world that we can say are part of the spiritual awakening process.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And then
Yeah.
my other question is, how might a spiritual experience? So I understand that at times the pathological paradigm of modern mental health can look at somebody having what looks like a spiritual experience and diagnose it as some form of psychosis. How might that be regarded in the opposite way? How might what maybe a person is coming to you or somebody else saying that they're having a spiritual experience, but maybe that is actually psychosis that they're dealing with.
And so the question is, if you put it in a nutshell,
How might sometimes psychosis is identified as a spiritual experience? How might that happen in the opposite direction?
well,
Have you
so
maybe
I'll
come
tell
across
you,
that, or?
Travis, I'm in a position personally as well as professionally at saying that the whole notion of what psychosis is needs to be rethought and redefined. So I don't even like to use the term.
Sure.
However, there are people who become who might be already quite unstable in their life, not have a sense of who they are, not be in a place where they've really had any kind of close connections with anyone, or feel actually very mistrustful of the world. So some of those people might enter into a very profound spiritual experience, but there's no structure within themselves that will make it easy for them to get grounded and to integrate the experience.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean that we need to say, well, they're mentally ill. As far as I'm concerned, what we may need to say is it will take longer for that particular person to integrate their experience and to become grounded overall. So you might be interested in going to imhu.org and looking at a course we have of how to differentiate spiritual crisis from pathology. And we have a table that really helps in terms of looking at this. And generally, we don't like to create some kind of a binary, like it's either spiritual emergency or it's mental illness. So instead, we're looking at it from the point of view of some things will take longer to resolve. Some people will need more time to resolve and integrate spiritual experiences. So that's not putting anyone in the category of mental illness. And again, I'm not anti-psychiatry, but I think that we've been a little bit too hasty to put people in certain categories.
I like that a lot. Thank you so much, Dr. Bragdon. I'm glad that I asked those questions.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
We have now Fisher.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm a doctor and a psychotherapist, and I've experienced some experiences like that myself. I was just wondering about safeguards. It's not always clearly demarcated of sort of being in spiritual emergence or being in, shall we say, a more normal way of being. You slip into the two sometimes. You can slip into spiritual emergence a little bit and then go back and forth. Is that true? Is there any safeguards to protect yourself from getting too deep into your spiritual experience? And perhaps losing yourself in the process.
And do what to yourself in the process?
It could be losing yourself in the process. So if you slip too deeply into a spiritual experience. So how is there a safeguard, the grounding techniques, all of that? Will that be taught in the course?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, Fisher, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. Pardon me for that.
No, it's perfect.
Oh, okay. I just want to say that that's such a great question you ask. And I think for those people who decide for whatever reason that they want their life really to be about spiritual awakening, it's how to stay balanced in that process is a really big question. And one of the people that I follow, Yogananda, who is considered to be completely awakened and enlightened, talks about the path of spiritual awakening like a razor's edge, so that it's very easy to become unbalanced, to fall to one side or another. And so having a teacher and having a particular meditation path can be extremely important, as well as knowing skills like being grounded and other
Yes.
things. But yes, that's covered in the course.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for the question.
We have
Gabriel, who are you and how are we doing?
Yes, now we're approaching the end of the session, but we still have one more question by Andreas, who
Okay.
has raised his hand.
All right. Andreas, there you are.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Emma. I want to say thank you for dedicating so much of your time and life to this spiritual mission. I believe it's very important because we have English is not my mother language, so I will try to express myself. We have a psychiatry who's working against spiritual awakenings in some way, and it's probably one of the most, I believe, the most important spiritual missions on earth, because we need to wake up. So I'm really thankful to the work that you do. I have been going through processes myself, spiritual emergence this year, and I'm currently going to say it's an ongoing process. And I was wondering about shamanic crisis. I have read about shamanic crisis in some of these books, but I cannot really seem to find more detailed information about personal information, what the person experience, and wonder where I can find this, someone going through a shamanic crisis, more personal of how it can affect someone emotionally, physically, spirit, and also that's one question. And I've also gone through this spiritual coach directory, and I can see that many, some have experience of spiritual emergence, and many have experience about this Kundalini awakening, but I cannot find someone that has gone through shamanic crisis. So I'm wondering, because this is something I'm experiencing, and also a lot of the other categories. So where can I find more detailed information about the shamanic crisis and someone who has gone through this?
Well, I'll tell you, in the 6-week course, we definitely go further into that and also give more resources for it. So I don't like to be salesy, if you know the term, but just to say that it's possible for someone like yourself to just become more familiar with the whole area of spiritual emergency, because shamanic crisis is definitely one way that it can manifest, but a shamanic crisis is actually part of a spiritual emergency. and learning more about the whole general territory and how to support oneself and how to support others can be extremely grounding and helpful. If you're in the midst of going through a shamanic crisis now, I would agree that it's probably a really good time to find resources that you can work with someone directly around it. I give personal coaching and consultation. I was deeply involved with the indigenous people of the United States for 20 years. So I know quite a bit about the shamanic crisis myself. But there are other people, and the spiritual emergence coaches can take this general point of view, even though they haven't maybe specifically been through a shamanic crisis. They know about spiritual emergency. So I highly recommend that you look further and maybe if you decide to work with a spiritual emergence coach, tell them that you have had a shamanic crisis and ask them if they're comfortable working with you around it. And if you feel like you're in a spiritual emergency or an emergence process, just let them know a little bit about what's going on and just ask them if they're comfortable with it. But my guess is they will say yes, and I'll work with you. And let's see if that will be helpful for you. And then there are people, I call them new age shamans because it's very difficult at this particular point in our history to be in direct contact with someone who comes out of the shamanic tradition in many, many cultures, because they've been either inundated by others from Europe or the United States, or they have just gone into retreat, or they're quite elderly. So it's hard to have that one-on-one contact with someone who came through a shamanic tradition. But there are, if you look into at least books in English, there are books that are written around shamanism and that go quite deeply into this. So I'm sorry, I can't can't tell you about other books that might be more available to you in your language. Are you Greek? Are you from?
I'm half Greek and half Swedish.
Oh, what a
But I
beautiful
do,
combination.
thank you. I do read English literature, and I do have coaches through your network, and I also attend shamanic circles as a way in integration. But still, I find it hard to. You can find information about shamanism and ceremonies and etc. But more of this crisis, like I've heard of people going through this crisis for many, many, many years, and it's quite of a journey. And for me personally, to be able to feel so much, and even in distance physically, and also can be both beautiful experiences, but also much to so I think the answer will come along the way. So thank you, and thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate it, and it's been a lifesaver for me.
Thank you for being so open with us all, Andreas, with what you're going through. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I wish you well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we need to close the session. I'm just posting now in the chat the two links. The first link to the 3-hour workshop that Emma is offering at the end of January, and the other link to the 6 weeks course that she's offering starting in March and continuing through April. And if you need more information, you have the information there. You can contact us. Feel free to contact us, and we will be very glad to just give you information, etc. So thank you, Emma, for offering this free open house session. And thanks everybody for attending. And we'll close the session here.
Thank you very much
Goodbye.
And thank you all who are here attending. It was a pleasure to be with you. I wish you well on your journeys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.